When you look at other laws, there's no change in the number of shootings when states adopt waiting periods, one gun a month rules, safe storage laws, penalties for using guns in crime, background checks. The National Brady Act seemed to have no impact on the rate of these. Assault weapons bans seem to have no impact. Gun show background checks seem to have no impact. One thing that was particularly interesting is that while higher arrest rates or the death penalty execution rates seem to lower murder rates generally, they didn't seem to have any consistent, statistically significant effect in reducing these particular types of crimes. And I think when you think about it, it's clear why that's the case, that the law enforcement penalties that we have are in effect after a crime's been committed. And the problem in these cases is that you're talking about 70% or so of these attackers die at the scene. A large number commit suicide, others are killed by someone else with a gun. There's a large gray area there where it's difficult to know where to classify these things, because sometimes people seem to force police or others to shoot them as kind of a way of committing suicide when they couldn't go and commit it themselves. And so you can see why penalties you impose after the fact may not have a big impact. But then that raises another question. Well, why do concealed handgun laws seem to have such a big impact on these things? And I think basically what's happening is that in their warped minds, one of the things that these people care about is trying to create as much carnage as possible. And to the extent to which you can kind of deprive them of this warped goal that they have, it reduces the return that they have to go and committing these types of crimes. And some of these guys decide not to go ahead and do this. Now, there are other things. I know I'm getting near out of time. There are other results I could go through and talk about. But let me just try to sum up a little bit, generally, a couple points about guns and crime. And that is, my research basically shows that there are two broad groups of people who benefit the most from having guns to protect themselves. One group are people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly, people who are relatively weaker physically. And the other group are basically poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. People who are most likely to be victims of crime benefit the most from having the option to be able to protect themselves. My guess is it probably doesn't fit too many people in this room. But now, my work finds that police are extremely important, probably, but no doubt in my mind, are the single most important factor for reducing violent crime. But I think one thing that police understand themselves, and you see this particularly in surveys of street officers, is that they realize even though they're extremely important in terms of higher arrest rates or other things in deterring criminals, they simply can't be there all the time. And so that raises the question, what do you recommend that someone do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And simply telling somebody to behave passively is actually dangerous advice. I can go through and explain what some of the problems are with it, but when you break down the data, we hear it all the time, but it comes from essentially making a comparison of passive behavior to all forms of active resistance lumped together. And when you do that, in fact, passive behavior is slightly safer. The problem with it, and the reason why I think it's misleading and actually extremely dangerous advice, is that people come away with that thinking that passive behavior is preferable to any type of active resistance, and that's simply not true. There's some types of active resistance which are much more dangerous than passive behavior, and some which are much safer. But when you're lumping them all together, I think you miss out on a lot of those differences. So, for example, I'll just go through this quickly. For a woman, by far the most dangerous thing for her to do is to use her fists. That's because you're virtually always talking about a male criminal doing the attacking. In the case of a male attacker and a female victim, if a woman uses her fists, there's a high probability of a physical response from the attacker, and given that, a high probability of serious injury or death to the woman. The next most dangerous thing for a woman to do is to run away. If you can run away and escape, that's great. But on average, the problem is women are much slower than that. And the process of being tackled and subdued and the resulting violence that may result from that, again, there's a very high probability of serious injury or death to the woman. But what you find when you break these things out, it's true across all groups for all crimes, what you find is that by far the safest course of action for someone to take when confronted by a criminal is to have a gun. Well, I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.